Hello and welcome to today's RIMS webinar sponsored by Global Risk Consultants, Natural Hazards, a data-driven guide to improving resilience and risk financing outcomes. I am Justin Smolison, Business Content Manager here at RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society. We've got a few notes before we get started. If you have a question for the presenters during today's session, please submit them by writing in the question box. The Global Risk Consultants team will reply to you directly during the Q&A portion at the end, and for those we cannot address today, the GRC team will reach out to you directly afterward. Following this session, the recording will be available through the on-demand events page of rims.org. All downloads and contact information will be accessible to the sponsor. And folks, RiskWorld 2026 will be held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, May 3rd through the 6th, and we are delighted that GRC will have a continuing presence with us at the world's largest annual risk conference. More information, including early bird registration, is on the events page of rims.org. And on with today's presentation. Whether you are facing hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, or severe convective storms, data is no longer just a supporting document for insurance submissions. It is the foundation of strategic risk management. Underwriters and senior leaders expect hard proof that your facilities are protected and resilient. Today, experts from Global Risk Consultants will show you exactly how to deliver that information. RIMS is thrilled to welcome a large global audience, and now I will hand it off to our moderator, Global Risk Consultants Head of Marketing, Jared Shelley.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is a webinar about natural hazards, and weather events are fundamentally redefining how insurers assess risk and how organizations prepare for the future. In just the first half of 2025, global insured losses from natural catastrophes are projected at $80 to $100 billion, well above recent averages. Last year alone, natural catastrophes caused $320 billion in total economic losses worldwide. While this year's hurricane season has been relatively moderate, the broader trend is clear. Natural hazard risks must be top of mind. The challenge now is to find data-driven ways to identify and mitigate those risks. Of course, that's no surprise to the insurance professionals and risk managers joining us today. You're on the front lines of these changes, seeing firsthand how Nat Cat events are reshaping underwriting and resilience planning. One approach? Take advantage of the softening insurance market and pockets of rate relief to reinvest premiums into risk engineering. Another is to ensure your teams are measuring the right resilience metrics, those that truly reflect vulnerability to perils like severe convective storms, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, and more. Today's speakers have decades of experience helping many of the world's leading organizations strengthen resilience and reduce loss potential. I'm Jared Shelley. I'm the guy in the bottom left-hand corner there. I'm the head of marketing for Global Risk Consultants, but I'd like to begin with our panel of experts, and I'd like to have them briefly introduce themselves and share a little bit about their careers and expertise before we get going. Marco, would you like to start?
Yeah, hi, Jerry. Thanks for having me on today. My name is Marco Petrelli, and I manage a natural hazards group at Global Risk Consultants. I am a licensed structural engineer with design and risk experience. I've been with GRC now for over a decade, focusing on natural hazard related loss estimations and loss prevention programs. I'm looking forward to today's webinar.
I'll go next. I'm David Ricks. I'm the Global Sales Manager for GRC. I've been with GRC for about 7 years. And prior to that, I was on the brokerage side with two global brokerage insurance firms. And I really want to thank Justin and the RIMS team for the opportunity to talk to the audience today about natural hazards. So thanks, Justin, for setting us up. Over to you.
I'm John Keating, and I'm based in London in the UK with Global Risk Consultants. I work here as an account manager with our clients in this part of the world and sometimes beyond. I have 30 plus years in different roles in the risk and insurance industry. And right now I'm coming up on 6 years with Global Risk Consultants with GRC, and very much looking forward to this event today. Thank you.
Yeah, we're very thankful to have you, John, and Marco, and David. Just a really terrific group, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. In today's session, you will learn the varying approaches to natural hazard risk assessments, steps to developing a successful natural hazard program, the most important metrics to measure. We have case studies about how 3 companies handled natural hazard risk identification and mitigation. We'll talk about specific insights on severe convective storms and flood exposure, and how to future proof your organization against emerging natural hazard risks. So here's how it's going to go. This will be a Q&A style discussion. I'll pose questions to our panelists throughout, but we encourage you to participate by submitting questions of your own into the Q&A box on your screen. We want this to be interactive, so don't be shy. Get those questions in. Okay, so now for my first question, I'm going to address this one to David Ricks. David, I spoke a little bit about market conditions, but can you please expand on that and explain the current state of the market and the risk management landscape and conditions?
Very good. Thanks, Jared. Yeah, so let me start by providing some context on why market conditions currently may create the need to focus on NatHaz risk assessment, data quality, and risk mitigation in order to achieve the best placement outcome in the marketplace. The recent market update that you see on the screen there from Lockton, and this has some Munich Re data, provides some context on the rate environment since 2024 and what can be achieved with good data quality. So the U.S. 2025 U.S. commercial property market year to date is marked by competitive pricing and expanded capacity, particularly through the E&S market. So far, so good from the standpoint of the 2025 hurricane season, which was predicted to be an active one and meant a cautionary outlook for market conditions in the future. You'll see on the next slide that while there's been some activity, it's been largely off to the Atlantic. But what you should keep in mind is that, as we've already seen on the previous slide with 80 billion in insured NatHaz losses so far through the first half of the year, this has been historically one of the costliest first halves of the year, with over 13 cat events exceeding 1 billion each in insured losses. So these events really highlight the increasing frequency and severity of secondary perils over primary perils, and we're going to touch on that today. And the industry is likely going to face continued climate-driven volatility. So in general, the extent to which an insured will benefit from current market conditions depends on their risk profile and claims history, of course, but quality submissions continue to matter, and presenting a complete risk profile to the market is essential. This is particularly the case for NatHaz data quality and proper collection of primary and secondary characteristics in accordance with RMS modeling requirements. Cat-driven, layered, and shared programs that bore the brunt of rate increases over recent years are expected to benefit the most in the current marketplace due to oversubscription and carrier desire to retain business. So what we're going to turn to next are the strategies and the tools that a risk manager can use to ensure that they have a sound approach to 3 key areas as respects natural hazard risk: data quality, risk assessment and quantification, and finally, risk mitigation steps that the organization has invested in to protect assets and operations. For many, market conditions will create the opportunity to reinvest in risk engineering and overall resiliency for climate-related events. So I'm going to turn this back to Jared so we can hear more on this from Marco and John. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. Really appreciate that. So, John, let's go to you. There are multiple approaches to natural hazard risk assessments. Can you explain the different types?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. There are multiple approaches to natural hazard risk assessment, and I'm going to step through them and just touch on a couple of advantages and disadvantages that are associated. So the first one is a portfolio analysis approach, and it's using a catastrophe model. RMS is a good example that David has just alluded to just recently. And a catastrophe model uses basic inputs, sums insured, geo coordinates, occupancy, basic construction attributes, and it applies a bunch of mapping based or associated hazards and damage curves, we call them, to deliver the outputs. It's really a top-down approach, and it works best for on a portfolio basis, where let's call it the law of large numbers applies, and it smooths out outliers in the data, and it's the bottom line output number is probably reasonably accurate using a catastrophe model or a portfolio basis. However, it doesn't offer a huge amount of granularity or site-specific outputs. It doesn't take those specific site attributes into account. And I'm talking about features like for flood, it would be finished floor elevations. Also for flood, it would be local protection, flood defenses, whether the municipal defenses or site defenses. For wind, it wouldn't be looking at specific construction features, occupancy features and nuances. Also, it doesn't take account of site access, utility dependency, and all that kind of stuff. But a good tool for reinsurance and for insurance underwriting. The second, another approach is via on-site assessments. And these are normally undertaken during property damage and business interruption, that's PDBI, surveys we call them for fire and associated perils. It's a more granular approach, and it takes into account those local features that I've spoken about just above, in addition to the local flood mapping and associated, the topographic features. However, as the name fire and associated perils infers, it's really an add-on to the basic fire survey, and more often than not is undertaken by engineers and consultants who probably aren't structural engineers and able to provide that nuanced, that detailed structural approach in the assessment of those natural hazards perils. So the outputs tend to be more qualitative than quantitative sometimes. Jared, can we get the next slide, please? Yeah, we got it?
Yeah, we've got it.
So GRC's natural hazards team offers an additional and an enhanced approach whereby a licensed structural engineer completes a site visit and a deeper dive into assessment of natural hazards perils. And these assessments take into account those detailed structural features, occupancy features, and our reports provide a really detailed output with a summary of hazards, including mapping, including historical loss events. We provide in the reports detailed probable maximum loss estimates, PML estimates, on a specific peril basis. And these will be, where appropriate, backed up by detailed structural analysis. And we provide recommendations then. The report will provide a series of recommendations to mitigate those PML exposures on a specific peril basis. And those PMLs will have a detailed scenario and an output with a dollar or another currency amount for property damage and business interruption loss estimates. Recommendations to mitigate are broken out, and Marco is going to talk about them in a couple of slides. So yeah, I'm going to pass it on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. And let's go to Marco for the next question. You're in the field helping successful companies assess and mitigate their natural hazard risks. Can you offer steps that businesses should take to develop a successful natural hazard assessment program?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. All right, yeah. Here are some steps that businesses should take, right, to develop a successful natural hazard assessment program. And ideally, we're addressing these hazard risks before potential damage occurs, right? In other words, we want to be in a position of being proactive and not reactive to market conditions or even natural hazard events. First, site-specific data is important, right? We live in a world with lots of uncertainties, and data helps us make educated decisions. So a detailed statement of value is key. We want accuracy in our loss estimates, and it benefits from loss. It's highly dependent on a comprehensive statement of value. In most situations, appropriate allocation of value to individual buildings and or major equipment categories would be greatly enhance loss estimates being provided. Detailed supply chain analysis of business interruption is also ideal. Can provide monthly estimates rather than just annual values. And when we're dealing with natural hazard events where the potential downtime is measured in weeks to months, use of an annual value can sometimes overestimate business interruption losses. Construction drawings, or some may refer to them as-built drawings, these are conditions for buildings. They can provide insight into material strengths and the structural systems used to resist natural hazard forces. And these drawings can also provide insight on expansions or alterations or modifications made to the buildings over its lifespan. and how those may influence how they may influence the performance during a natural hazard event. Grading plans, these can provide exterior grade and building finish floor elevations, which are critical for proper flood evaluation. Sometimes an elevational change of just 6 inches can be the determining factor between no damage and some damage. Geotechnical reports, you can get these maybe from some recent expansions on site, and they can provide some insight on soil stability for seismic evaluations. Data roofing, date of installation of roofing systems, provide insight on age and how they may perform in a windstorm event. And lastly, CAT models. In most cases, and John alluded to this earlier, in most cases, the site-specific documentation is rarely used to fill in CAT models input files. So your risk is generally not differentiated from the conditions associated with the prior loss claims. Next slide. Thanks, Jared. Site screening. We should identify sites located in natural hazard zones. Right. Some of us have access and utilize insurance carrier hazard risk maps from the likes of Munich Re, Swiss Re, and FM Global and such. These offer a one-stop solution. However, some maps may offer poor resolution as a concession for providing a global footprint. And sometimes this is the case with flood maps, where local flood sources are excluded from that map. Specific to the U.S., here are some trustworthy hazard map sources. United States Geologic Survey, right? They have various maps. One's the national map, where it utilizes high-quality LiDAR images to generate topo maps with some pretty good accuracy. We've got the National Seismic Hazard Map. This is where we get our seismic hazard, 500-year hazard. And it's developed by the USGS along with California Geology Survey. And they also provide seismic fault maps. FEMA, the flood hazard maps were developed back in the 1970s as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. We've got maps that are considered, assessments that are considered detailed analyses. And these maps will have accurate and have base flood elevations. But we'll also have some that are approximate methods where they're less predictable with no base flood elevations. And even we have some zoning that are undetermined risks, meaning no hazard analysis performed. I'd say approximately 25% of these maps are 10 years or older. And approximately 10% of these maps date back to the 1970s or 80s. Now, some of these are in low populated areas, so that's why they haven't been updated as much. We've got American Society of Civil Engineers. They got a Standard 7, which is the minimum design loads for buildings. Those define the 100-year flood and rain loads. And they will also define things such as various mean recurrence interval wind speeds for the U.S. And lastly, we can rely on a 2017 American Meteorological Society paper titled An Extreme Valley Model for U.S. Hail. Next slide. All right. Consider deep dive assessments for your high valued exposed sites. Natural hazard engineers can review site-specific data, hazard mapping, and perform on-site surveys to identify exposure and vulnerability. They're able to also estimate loss potential and provide loss prevention recommendations. Consider gathering CAT model secondary modifiers for your lower valued exposed sites, right? As John mentioned earlier, this kind of go beyond just a customary COPE data collection. It's more about like an add-on for fire and perils. Invest in resiliency. Consider developing a natural hazard program that focuses on effective execution of outstanding recommendations, right? We're going to have non-structural recommendations. These are typically low cap expenditures, right? Something that we refer to as low-hanging fruits in their short-term actions. There are also going to be structural recommendations, and these tend to be higher CapEx efforts. And sometimes they warrant a cost-benefit analysis, and as such, these tend to be more of a long-term action. Adopt recurring assessments, right? An effective program are those where follow-up assessments take place on a regular basis, approximately every 5 or so years. And this helps drive down the loss prevention. You should also consider a one-time deep dive assessment of supply chain partners just to better develop your contingency plans.
Great. Thank you so much, Marco. Really appreciate that detailed answer. I'm going to stay with you, Marco, for this next question. What are the most important metrics to measure?
Sure. I'd say up-to-date emergency response plans is on top of the list. A plan that undergoes annual review and annual drills that focuses on those site-specific natural hazards. The response plan should include, first aid kits, water, non-perishable foods, and emergency communication, and then other things that are related to the natural hazard specific to the site. We should also focus on active and natural hazard protected emergency systems. To mind, if fire protection is a big one, right? The goal here is to mitigate fire following a natural hazard event, such as a strong earthquake event. And power, for emergency lighting and emergency communication equipment, even fire protection pumps and basement sump pumps and UPSs for IT systems. We also want to, another metric would be building maintenance program, annual inspections of preventative or corrective repairs of roofing systems, maybe your roof gutters or your flashing and cladding systems. Building closure should remain in good condition, right, to mitigate windstorm-related damage. And similarly, we want to make sure we inspect and repair any necessary works for the emergency power system, power and fire protection. Execution on loss prevention recommendation. Again, a program that you're not executing on those recommendations is a program that's not really delivering on its promise. And tracking that's progress, right? Maybe there's going to be an improvement to facility risk score over time. And then ultimately your loss estimates and a reduction in loss estimates over time would be important to track.
Great. Thank you, Marco. And John, let's go to you now. We want to get into the case studies here. Can you provide a few case studies and success stories featuring companies that have handled a natural hazard assessment successfully?
Yeah, sure, Jared. I'm going to talk about two case studies, and both of which are windstorm assessment case studies. And the first one is our team works with a US-based broker whose clients construct and operate a bunch of hotels, leisure, and retail facilities, often in windstorm-exposed parts of the United States and the Caribbean as you call it. And these projects are typically financed by bank debt. And part of the bank agreements tends to be that the client will purchase full value PDBI windstorm insurance cover, which at best is expensive and sometimes not available in harder risk transfer markets. So the broker uses our team to support their efforts to challenge against the necessity to buy full value by our completion of windstorm studies for these facilities, where our engineers visit and make the on-site assessments as we've described, and develop, again, using structural analysis, develop credible, but conservative, but credible 1 in 500 year probable maximum loss PML events for wind. And the broker uses, and their clients use these outputs to, put themselves in a position whereby they can purchase a more realistic and a more reasonable and a more cost-effective level of windstorm cover for these properties. So it works really well. And you can see there that, one of the sites, just as an example, the total sum insured was 200 million. And our assessment produced a windstorm PML of 30 million. With the recommendations as we described earlier, and if they are completed, that'll take the PML down to 20 million. So it makes it very cost effective. Next slide, please, Jared.
Okay.
Okay, so our second case study is just a brief story of what we've done with a client in the pharmaceutical sector who who engaged us to undertake a windstorm survey of a facility. And ostensibly, it was to test and give them some comfort as to the limit they bought on windstorm. But on this site, we came across a bunch of stuff associated with securement of air handling equipment and dust collection on the roof of the facility, uh, whereby if a severe windstorm or hurricane event did occur, that there was likely to be um, the equipment was likely to break loose and puncture the roof membrane, which would cause significant structural damage, but also secondary damage from water ingress and from debris across the remainder of the site. So yeah, that was a second a good story to tell, I think. And with that, I'm now going to hand on to Marco, who's going to talk about some other case study work that we've done.
Thanks, John. Case study number 3. So, there's a global corporation with a manufacturing facility in Japan. As we all know, Japan is often referred to as a very seismically risk-adverse nation. Structural vulnerabilities. Majority of the buildings were built in the 1970s to 1990s, with many key buildings predating the modern seismic design principles associated with the 1981 the Building Standard Law. Non-structural vulnerabilities. There are a lot of unanchored, unbraced, or inadequately restrained architectural features and utilities, storage systems, or production equipment. Loss prevention audits. Baseline was performed back in 2015, with follow-up audits performed in 2020 and 2025 this year. So basically, this loss prevention program is over a 10-year period. Loss prevention recommendations. There were 60, including retrofit of key buildings. Included production buildings, warehouses, and utility buildings. On the recommendations that were completed, there were approximately 53 to date, which also included retrofit of these vulnerable buildings mentioned earlier. Next slide. So from a loss estimates perspective, back in 2015, the initial loss estimates, total loss estimates were approximately 67 million. Over the 10-year course period, with all the 53 recommendations completed, including strengthening of buildings, the present loss estimate is approximately 36 million, right? This resulted in a 31 million reduction in loss over that 10-year period. They spent approximately 17 million on loss prevention actions, right? So about 17 million is on the order of 5% of the property value. And there's a 14 million reduction in financial burden had the 500-year event occurred or to be occurred, in the near future. But I think also that's important here is the indirect savings that tend to be a little harder to quantify, right? From supply chain perspective, we reduced the prolonged shutdowns and supply chain interruptions. Resiliency, we increase the likelihood of a long-term operational performance. Insurance, ability to negotiate better terms and limits. And lawsuits, proactive loss prevention reduces lawsuit associated with seismic risk negligence. From tax perspective, retrofit costs are considered capital improvements and they can be depreciated over time. And the most important, I think, here also is reputational damage, right? Reduced risk of unfavorable news that could deteriorate a brand image or investor confidence, or consumer or public trust, right? And that one's very hard to quantify, but definitely a high value indirect savings.
Thank you so much, Marco. And before we get to our next question, I just want to remind the audience that we'd like to hear from you. Get those questions in. We want this to be interactive. We'll set aside some time at the end for some Q&A. So please get those questions in. We're looking to hear from you and ask away. Now for my next question, that's going to go to you, Marco. And let's talk about some specific risks that are surely top of mind for risk managers and insurance professionals, namely severe convective storm and flood. Can you discuss those specific exposures?
Yeah, sure. Severe convective storms, these are They're typically associated with thunderstorm events, right? They produce downburst winds, hails, tornadoes, lightning. Supercell events. They're approximately 10 miles wide and a forward motion of 40 miles an hour or so, and they can last 2 to 6 hours, right? They can produce gust wind speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour and over quite a large area, 2.5 mile diameter or so. So these are sometimes accompanied by 2-inch or larger hailstones and destructive tornadoes. So in most cases, the losses are typically attributed to the strong winds, and large hailstones, and in rare occasions, a direct tornado strike. So, what we're looking for here, we definitely want to restrain rooftop and outdoor equipment, right? We want to minimize the potential for unrestrained equipment to become windborne debris. Rooftop, we want to make sure that they're not rolling around and puncturing the roofing system, and which could lead to rainwater infiltration. We want to perform annual rooftop inspections, as I mentioned earlier, right, to maintain those roof drains are clear, ensure positive slope. We don't want we want to avoid water ponding, which can deteriorate the quality and the quality of the materials for the roofing system. What else? Strong wind pressure can cause wind splashing to rip away and leaving vulnerable edges to of the roofing system to peel. We want to replace aging roofing systems prior to the end of warranty, right, or its useful life, and that's very critical. We'd like to avoid ballasted roof systems where the gravel can become windborne projectiles. You might want to consider replacing non-impact resistant skylights and windows with impact resistant versions. They're the laminated types. Roll-up doors, for industrial settings, definitely consider hurricane-rated roll-up doors, especially start looking at these 100 to 110 and greater wind speeds. And then from a tornado perspective, maybe regions that are subject to EF0s, EF2s, we might want to consider a best available refuge area. That's FEMA P431. And for areas where, historically EF3s and 5s have occurred, you may want to consider going all the way up to an ICC 500 tornado shelter. And lastly, from a lightning perspective, we want to make sure you've got lightning protection systems installed in accordance with NFPA 780. Next slide. Flood. All right, we may design for a flood event that occurs, that has a 1% probability of occurrence on an annual basis. But really, when you think about a lifetime of building, there's probably a 40% chance in a lifetime of building that this flood event might occur. So we really should be looking to be proactive and not reactive to such a potential event. Next slide. There are many sources of flood hazards, right? We got rainfall hazard where excessive downpour becomes surface runoff. We got riverine or excessive downpour or snow melt, can cause rivers and creeks to overflow. We got storm surge, caused by hurricane winds, and we even have urban flooding, due to inadequacies in the stormwater drainage system. So depending on the extent of flooding, here are some general recommendations. I think that first and foremost, developing that flood emergency plan is key. Focusing on those temporary barriers, those emergency generators, making sure you've got the feel for that, for flood pumps or sump pumps. Looking at elevating critical equipment and content, making sure we got a good and robust backup system for the IT. Perform, those periodic maintenance inspections that I mentioned earlier, right? We got to ensure the site generators are clear from debris, and sump pumps and generators are in functioning conditions. Floodgates are in good condition. Review walls and penetrations for cracks or potential, leak points. If you have any berms on site, make sure that they don't have excess, vegetation growth on them, or they're cracked or potential for leaking. You may want to subscribe to a flood warning system, or early warning system. These are typically provided by the local county or city's emergency and alert system. The National Weather Service provides, flood forecasts and warnings. All right. Now, if a site is exposed to wave action from coastal flooding, right, I think consider relocating to a non-flood prone site. Now, energies associated with wave impacts that make the conventional loss prevention techniques ineffective. So, it's, I think, long, short, in short, selecting a non-flood prone location, would be probably the best way to do it. Next slide. All right, now if flood is a site-wide risk covering the entire site, again, you may want to consider relocating to non-flood prone site. That's costly yet one way of solving that solution. There can be a lot of complexities in implementing a site-wide flood protection system, and that could sometimes be less attractive. Consider elevating individual buildings and key equipment, or consider maybe a site-wide perimeter berm or flood wall around the whole site. Next slide. Now, if flood is an isolated risk, right? Maybe it's a building or two. For those buildings, you might want to consider maybe changing building occupancy, right? Maybe it was storing critical items, and now it becomes a non-critical storage building. Improve drainage, to convey floodwaters away from buildings. Most drainage systems are only designed for a 5 to 10 year return period. So will ponding in a 100-year event lead to building or critical equipment inundation? That's a question we should ask ourselves. Maybe consider an on-site storm basin to retain that 100-year flood waters or 500-year flood waters. Again, the goal here is to get the water pulled away from buildings. You've got a couple options. You can do wet proofing or dry proofing, flood proofing. Wet flood proofing, that's where the interior of the building's allowed to flood. And then your vulnerable equipment, such as utilities or production equipment, they're elevated or protected in place. When considering wet proofing, consider also the fact that you got the post-event cleanup efforts, and that you're likely to be, dealing with contaminated waters, which may result in some health concerns. Dry flood proofing, consists of watertight doors and windows and reinforced walls to withstand those hydrostatic pressures and debris impact. Right? Typically, you're looking at a building that's maybe got concrete walls around the perimeter. That could be a good contender. You're also going to be looking at installing backflow valves at sewer lines. You're going to probably provide some proper interior drainage for any sort of potential leakage might occur. And you're probably still going to look at elevating some key interior equipment, some key utilities, or units of value, maybe a valuable production equipment or something of that nature. But when considering dry flood proofing, also consider the fact that it's difficult and complex to execute. Especially due to those hydrostatic pressures that build up on the perimeter of the building. And typically, they become cost prohibitive once you get flood depths that are probably on the order of 3 feet or greater. Right? If you got outdoor tanks, right, you need to resist those buoyancy effects. You don't want them floating away, so those exterior tanks should be anchored down. And then again, on exterior, you might want to elevate when you key equipment, or let's say something's maybe prone to debris impact. You might want to barricade those equipments by providing some sort of barrier, if you will. All right, Jared.
Great. Thank you, Marco. Really appreciate that. And David, the next question's for you. Can you discuss the importance of insured asset valuations in all of this? It's a bit of an open secret in the industry that valuations are out of alignment after recent inflation. So why is it so important to keep current and accurate valuations?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. This should be fairly brief. I mean, I think property valuations really right now are kind of less of a hot button issue, certainly than they were in the hard market at the height of the hard market. But because we all know that keeping the property valuations current is critical to avoid surprises when a claim occurs. And then, ultimately in the future, the market may be less favorable. This may come under more scrutiny. So keeping this top of mind continues to be important. As we mentioned, this just sort of ties to the engineering side. The valuations obviously are used to develop the loss estimates. So you got to have accurate projections on the LEs if want to get into some of the assessment work that Marco and John have been describing. Even in the current market environment, our valuation team is seeing a high demand, continued for appraisal services. One of the things that we try to do with most clients, depending on their occupancy, oftentimes a desktop assessment can be very cost effective and is a great way to identify an outlier or two for further review on the SOB. So certainly an important part of your property renewal strategy should continue to review values, make sure you have the backup to support the documentation and the annual trending that you're doing. And that's going to continue to be critical. So back to you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, David. And John, we'll go to you for the final question from me. But I would like to tell the audience, please get your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. We certainly want this to be interactive, so keep getting those questions in. John, there are also ways to future-proof your business against natural hazard risks by taking a look into climate risks and how they may affect your business down the road. Can you explain how that works and the benefits of doing such an exercise?
Yeah, Jared, thanks. It's a good question. So we are seeing the impact of climate change, and it's presenting emerging and increasing challenges for us. And these challenges are compounded sometimes by other factors like increasing urbanization, societal trends, and changes in the built environment, which sometimes are coming together to present those challenges, as I said. And a really good example of this stuff is last year in Dubai, in the Middle East, there was a significant pluvial flood event. So pluvial flood is flooding that occurs from accumulations of surface water following intense rainstorm or rainfall. And it's exacerbated by literally concreting of areas where previously rainfall would soak into the ground. If you can imagine, in Dubai, there's been massive urbanization and development. So anyway, a hospital was impacted by a pluvial flood event. I think they got about 900 millimeters, 3 feet of water in the lower stories of the building, the ground, the bottom floor. And we were engaged to follow up and help and support them with efforts to prevent a recurrence, prevent a recurrence of this. And we did through recommendations around temporary floodgates, sump pumps, maintenance tests, and other flood emergency response programs. The Marco was already described. With respect to climate change, we now have models, and models are being developed that will map the trajectory of greenhouse gas accumulations on a go-forward basis and show how these may well impact on metrics around sea level rise, on windstorm, rainfall intensity, and flood river levels. So we are now able to make, or starting to make, those catastrophe models and maps, make those dynamic so that we can, on a future forward basis, help clients to not alone assess and mitigate what current challenges are from natural hazards, but also what they might be in 25, 50 years and going out along the life cycle of a project or a building. Yeah, with respect to future proofing, look, it's all part of an overall sustainability strategy, I would suggest. And that strategy is going to protect in an insurable risk context, but also in a wider brand reputation context. And here in Europe, there's probably just something else that's worth a mention as we go by. There are benefits with sustainability programs for entities with respect to capital funding. For example, in the European Union, the provisions of the EU Green Deal taxonomy provides for entities with who can demonstrate good sustainability strategies and policies that they will receive favorable consideration from the banks and from the capital markets for funding. So it's in many ways a much broader topic than risk assessment in an insurance context. So yeah, that's me done, Jared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate that answer. And before we get to the Q&A, let's quickly recap a few key points from today's discussion. First, the property insurance market is softening, which creates an opportunity for companies to reinvest premium savings into risk engineering and resiliency. And while this year's hurricane season has been relatively mild, 2025 has already seen more than a dozen billion-dollar events. A reminder that natural hazard risks aren't slowing down. We also heard that data quality makes all the difference. Accurate, site specific information drives credible loss estimates and better underwriting outcomes. And as we heard, there are several approaches to natural hazard assessments, and each has its place depending on your goals and risk profile. So, developing a strong natural hazard program means being proactive, maintaining detailed statements of value and construction data, and revisiting assessments regularly to measure progress. And we also discussed that severe convective storms and flood remain top concerns, reinforcing rooftop equipment, replacing aging roofs, and considering flood proofing or relocation can dramatically reduce risk exposure. And don't overlook property valuations. They're critical to avoiding surprises in claims or renewals. And finally, as John just said, future proofing is now possible. We can use climate data to model risks decades from now, helping companies strengthen sustainability, resilience, and even bankability. At the end of the day, resilience pays off financially, operationally, and reputationally. The more you invest in engineering and data, the stronger your position in the market will be. So I want to thank our panelists here. Did a wonderful job. And I'm going to leave this slide here. It has our email addresses, and please follow us on LinkedIn as well. We're Global Risk Consultants, and you can find us here on our website. But we'll go now to the Q&A, and please get your questions in if you have some more. I'll go to the first question here. How can companies ensure their natural hazard assessments are consistent across a global portfolio, especially when data quality and local hazard models vary widely by region? Who wants to take that one? Happy
Uh,
to read it off again if you like.
I'll take that one,
Okay.
Jared. Yeah, that's a good point. And we do a lot with multinational corporations and locations. So it's key to, rather than focus on local hazard maps, to focus on maps that are more globally. One that jumps to mind is something like earthquakes, where we can get a global presence at a single source. Those are great. That's really a way to unify a global loss prevention program, and making sure we're each side are being measured against the same sort of hazard potential. While that works great for something like earthquake, I think flood is one where that's a bit challenging. With these global maps you might get from insurance carriers, where again, to get a global footprint, you get that with a reduced resolution. That's where you can create such great large maps. So that's where sometimes I think more of a local or more of a government level, or something like that is more important, especially if they're reliable. And I think so. In essence, it's kind of it's hard, right? I guess it might be more of a natural hazard dependent situation.
Okay. Thank you, Marco. Let's go to the next question here. How can organizations use historical loss data and predictive analytics together to improve accuracy in modeling potential natural hazard losses?
I'll take it, Jeff. Say it one more time, just so I make sure I get it right.
Sure. How can organizations use historical loss data and predictive analytics together to improve accuracy in modeling potential natural hazard losses?
I mean, I think that if you have site-specific loss data, right? Let's say you got a site that's constantly flooding, right? And let's say the regional maps or global maps suggest otherwise. I mean, clearly, focusing on historical damage is probably of most value here. So, I think that on a local perspective, the terrain features may not be appropriately accounted for in these global models or these regional models, and you got to go with that. I mean, if I go to site visit and they're telling me that this parking lot floods every 10 years, and the flooding infringes on the building, I think we got to start talking about how do we maybe shed the water from the parking lot away from the building, and maybe regrading. That might be as simple as that. I'm going to regrade that parking structure to again get to at least minimize the risk on a 10-year returning basis, and which would obviously ultimately also benefit for larger return period events.
Great. Thanks, Marco. Here's another question. Do you partner with property insurance carriers like FM that do their own internal property loss assessments? Not sure who might want to take that. Maybe David?
Um, I don't know about partnering, but we certainly would, to the extent that we have available data from likes of FM or any insurance carrier, Marco and team would digest that and incorporate it into the analysis. So certainly any pre-work that's been done most definitely gets taken into consideration and is reviewed. I don't know, Marco or John, if there's anything else you want to add to that, but yeah, we work very closely with carriers to understand what's been done in the past. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Great.
agreed.
Yeah, here's another question here. How can risk managers translate complex hazard data into actionable insights that resonate with finance teams, boards, and insurers, especially when advocating for investment in resilience?
Yeah, Jared, I'll take this one
Okay.
if I can. It's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it, using data and assessment. So, if a risk manager has a facility that's inside a 1 in 100 year flood zone and engages the GRC natural hazards team to help, as we've described, our assessment and our report will probably confirm that 1 in 100 year exposure. But per the table that Marco has previously shown us, we will highlight the fact that over the, let's say, 30-year expected life cycle of the facility, they're probably looking at, a 1 in 4, maybe greater chance that a flood event of that magnitude will occur. And that makes the exposure very immediate, and very immediate to the extent that it's probably more immediate than, let's say, a large fire loss or a large machinery breakdown event. Um, the report will also contain a detailed loss scenario backed up by analysis, uh, as Marco has described, and recommendations for mitigations. We'll come to that in a moment. But we will have in the loss estimate development a detailed monetary loss figure for property damage and for business interruption. So we also then, as I said, will present a bunch of recommendations to mitigate that exposure. And alongside those recommendations, we will produce let's call it the residual loss estimates, the reduction in exposure that will flow from the mitigation events being implemented. So that gives the risk manager a really credible and a really good narrative around the likelihood, the probability of the event occurring, but also enables the risk manager to put that into the language that boards and finance stakeholders will understand. For example, we will put the risk manager in a position to make a cost benefit analysis in terms of risk reduction versus cost to complete mitigation recommendations. And a combination of those outputs and those assessment outputs and results, puts the risk manager in a very good position to articulate and to advocate for those risk improvements and mitigations that ultimately will probably yield a really good result in terms of overall total cost of risk.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And all right, that's it for us. And we'll send it back to Justin from RIMS for a final word. Thanks, everyone.
All right. That was fantastic. Special thanks to David Ricks, Marco Petrilli, John Keating, and Jared Shelley of Global Risk Consultants for their time and expertise. The GRC team has your questions and will reply directly to you if we didn't address yours today. A copy of this webinar will be archived on rims.org within a few business days. Look at the webinars page. You'll find it there on the bottom. There are lots of resources for you all to access. Find them at tuvsu.com/GRC. You can also find Global Risk Consultants through their LinkedIn page. And as you can see, Jared, Marco, David, and John have their emails up here on the screen as well. Now, folks, other episodes of RIMScast, which I host for RIMS, and white papers featuring the insight of Global Risk Consultants are available through the Risk Knowledge page of rims.org. So go there, click on the white papers page, the podcast page, and you'll see more GRC thought leadership. Finally, RIMS is global, and we would love for you to build your network with us. Visit rims.org/membership to apply for a RIMS membership. Thank you all, and stay safe.